I was thinking about the topic and what would be of interest, and obviously COVID is of interest now and to everyone, but there's also perhaps an overdose and some kind of fatigue hearing about COVID all the time. I think the news, you don't hear anything else much these days. So what I thought I would do is maybe take a broader view about preparing for pandemics. And just a couple of days ago, I saw this article that had compared the preparatory activities of countries as judged by the Joint External Evaluation, what's called the JEE. Maybe just taking a step back. So international health regulations have been around for quite some time, and in 2005, they were renegotiated by countries with WHO. So there are 196 countries that have signed on to the international health regulations, which basically set out how countries should set up systems to detect, to prevent, to respond, and also to report any sort of unusual activities. And this happened, I think, after SARS, when there was a realization that there was a delay in reporting, and that led to a lot of transmission happening before WHO was really able to get to the bottom of it. And of course, this was 2003-4. So the science was also less advanced at that time. And we can contrast a little bit, perhaps, the response at that time and now. Now, this is a related virus. It's a SARS-CoV-2 virus. It has several properties which are very different from the SARS-CoV-1 in terms of transmissibility and the speed with which it's gone around the world. So at that time, 2005, countries agreed that there needs to be some kind of a global system. And the international health regulations were discussed and finalized. And in the last couple of years, about 100 countries have undertaken what's called the JEE, Joint External Evaluation, and sort of graded themselves. And there's been another index called the Global Health Security Index, which has been developed by an independent group. And they have also used the JEE scores, and they've helped to grade countries. So I think India is somewhere in the middle on that grade. Even though we have not had a JEE, there's also a self-reporting system that countries have to report on their what they consider their preparedness to be to WHO. Now, it turns out that the countries which scored the highest on the JEE scores are actually the ones with big disasters right now in terms of COVID epidemiology and transmission, including United States being one of the countries which had a high score. And they also have a number of commissions and committees over the years set up to prepare for pandemics, particularly for influenza pandemics. So as you all know, the previous pandemics were all caused by influenza virus. And there's been 6 of them. And that is why there was also a delay, or not a delay, but a consideration of whether to call this a pandemic or not, because there had never been a pandemic with any other organism. So there hadn't been really thought given to the criteria for calling something a pandemic. So this is the first coronavirus pandemic. And I don't think that any of us ever thought when we woke up on the 1st of January this year that this is the situation that we're going to be in 6 months down the road. So there are a lot of obviously terrible things that have happened over the last 6 months in terms of loss of lives, livelihoods, economies, complete disruption of people's lives, etc., and impact on other health issues. Health systems capacities have been overwhelmed. So that's impacted on delivery of other health services like immunization services, antenatal. We did a survey recently in about 80 countries. And in almost all of them, there was either severe or partial disruption of routine health services. The most commonly impacted was immunization. Almost 80% of immunization activities had been impacted. But it also included antenatal care, institutional deliveries, care for non-communicable diseases, emergency care, which should not have been disrupted. Of course, elective surgeries, then things like dental care, rehabilitation, mental health. One of the things we've seen is the increase in mental health problems across the world, both in young people, but also in the elderly who have felt a lot more isolated. And in domestic violence and violence against women and children. This has really gone up. And there have been a lot of organizations who have highlighted that the lockdowns, one of the impacts it's had is on increasing in domestic violence and possibly an increase also in trafficking of women and children. And that's related to, of course, the economic impact that this pandemic is having, especially in the poorer countries and among the poorer populations of countries. So it's beyond anything that could have been imagined, the scope of it. But the sad thing is that pandemics have been predicted by many, many groups and agencies. It was always a question of when, not if. And it was known that it would be a respiratory virus. Most likely it was known that it would come from animals, it would be zoonotic. And yet we did not have systems in place to be able to deal with it when it actually happened. And most countries, many countries, took it very lightly at the beginning. Even at the time when in January, WHO was putting out a lot of information on this and asking all countries to be on high alert and to take all steps to prevent the spread of or the transmission within their own countries. It happened. It still happened, and what made country sit up and pay attention was when the hospitals started filling up with sick patients. Till then, it was sort of undetected in the community. Now, one of the things that's a positive about this pandemic, I think someone was asking me the other day, what do you think is the difference between this pandemic and the previous pandemics? Maybe 2 or 3 differences, I would say. The first one is that the science has advanced so much, even compared to 2005. So today, we have genomic capacities in most places, most countries. And certainly China has very advanced genomics capacities. And therefore, we were in a situation on the 11th of January where the first 6 sequences of the SARS-CoV-2 was uploaded on a public database, the GISAID database, and it was also sent to WHO. What is GISAID? GISAID was set up 10 years ago to be a repository for influenza genomic sequence data, because influenza has a long history of collaboration, global collaboration. There are the influenza reference centers, the WHO Influenza Reference Center. There's a network called the Global Influenza Surveillance and Response Network, a research network, ISRIS. And there's a long history of collaboration and sharing of samples. And then this was set up for rapid sharing of sequence data, and more than 130 countries are involved in that. So what they did was very quickly, they were able to create a platform for this new virus at the request of the Chinese scientists. And then these sequences were uploaded. Within 48 hours, we have a diagnostic test that was created, an SOP for a diagnostic test, a molecular test, an RT-PCR, and therefore we disseminated that on the 13th of January. So countries were able to put in place diagnostics within a couple of days of the announcement of this new virus. Now, this is very different, obviously, from what we've seen in the past. And GISAID has now today about 60,000 sequences from all over the world, allowing scientists to do phylogenetic analysis, to be able to sort of map the epidemiology of this, to map how, where and how, based on the clades in the different regions of the world, how transmission could have happened, to be able to go back and track what was the time when this actually began. Was it November? Was it December? Was it earlier than that? And also, of course, to track the mutations in the virus itself. And there's one particular mutation, the D614G mutation, which scientists are very closely looking at, because in vitro, in lab, the cell culture, this mutation allows the virus to replicate faster. And therefore, it could be associated potentially with increased transmissibility, because if it's replicating faster, then there's a higher viral load, and you could and potentially theoretically, it could be that the people who have the virus with this mutation could be transmitting more, but again, you need epidemiological studies. What is the need of the hour today is a combination of traditional and genetic epidemiology. Because to answer these kind of questions, and there's a lot of speculation, you will see in media stories about there's a particular strain in this state, particular strain in this area, particular strain, that's why there are less deaths, that's why there are more deaths. Cannot make those associations without putting together the data from the clinical and epidemiological profiles and the genome sequence data. And you need a fairly large database, and that's why these global databases are useful. But GISAID has only genetic sequence data. I don't think it has a lot of clinical information. It has some. But certainly for a country like India, to develop that for diseases would be a great idea. And maybe the academies could come together and think about how one could construct. And of course, Partha is the guru in this. So I shouldn't be saying more about that, except to say that these linkages can only be made when you bring together the genetic data and the clinical and public health data that we have. And it's useful. It can inform both clinical management and public health if such associations are found. There's also research going on the genetic predisposition and whether there are certain protective factors or susceptibility factors. Strangely enough, the blood group A and O have been associated, A with more severity and blood group O with lesser severity of the disease. Again, this is because the genes for these blood groups are co-linked with genes for other parts of the immune system. And so we're learning a lot. So I would say the second thing about this pandemic, perhaps which is different from the previous pandemics and which is related to my first point, is that the science has moved very fast. And, we track publications on a daily basis. On an average day, there are 500 to 600. On some days, there are 1,000 publications per day that we need to track. And we have a database of over 20,000, maybe today it's even 25,000, I don't know, publications. We're also tracking preprints, of course, and that is both preprints have advantages and disadvantages. Advantages are that scientists get to see the latest information as soon as it's out, and they also can comment on the quality of the paper or on the methodology, etc. The downside is that the media picks it up and headlines appear even before it has been verified and peer-reviewed and published. So the amount of science, of course, some good and some bad. I think all the science that's coming out is not good science. And we've seen even cases where papers had to be retracted from very prestigious journals because there was question marks about the source of their data. And that was very, very sad because, it was about a clinical issue. It was about treatment of patients. And to have published papers based on unverifiable data sets which impact the treatment of severely ill patients, I think was very, very unethical. And I hope will not happen. But again, these were peer-reviewed, top-class journals which published it. Obviously, they're also rushing through peer review, and sometimes these mistakes can happen. What is the third thing I would say different about this pandemic? It's what we call the infodemic. Alongside the viral epidemic, there has been a huge profusion of overload of information, and a lot of it is misinformation and myths and rumors that have circulated on social media, whether it's about the origin of the virus and how it has been constructed in the lab, etc., or it's a bioweapon, or it's about people spreading it in certain ways. And a lot of it is stigmatizing to certain communities and certain groups. So myths and misinformation and rumors actually can really impede the public health response of a country. And so we actually have a big program in WHO just to deal with this, what we call the infodemic. And we have a program called EpiWin, which actually works with a lot of partners around the world and comes up with FAQs, comes up with small videos, comes up with social media messaging and clips and all kinds of means to spread the correct information. And what we did was also we worked with social media companies, with like Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, as well as WhatsApp, Pinterest, to be able to ensure that when somebody does a search for a particular, they type in say COVID, they're actually taken to a website of a authoritative or a reputable agency, and they don't go into one of these misinformation sites. And particularly now that vaccines are being developed and are a hot topic, and everybody's looking forward to the vaccine coming, there's also a big anti-vax movement which has started. And we were joking the other day, but it's not a joke really, but the fact that anti-vax movement has started for something there is no vaccine. And we've seen with diseases like measles, the harm that happens when the public reduces the vaccination to their children, or they stay away, they don't believe in it. We've had measles outbreaks last year, the highest number of measles cases and measles deaths that we've seen in the past decade. And the regions of the world like Latin America, which have been declared measles free, had a huge number of measles outbreaks in many countries, and similarly in Europe, there were measles outbreaks. So we know what can happen. Luckily, in the low and middle income countries, the anti-vax is not so strong. Most people believe in vaccination, maybe because they've seen the benefits of vaccination. We've seen polio going away. We've seen, the reduction in child deaths due to pneumonia and diarrhea because of vaccines. So, to a large extent, India and other countries which are even lower income are protected from that, but we don't know for long, because there's again the social media can play a lot of mischief, and we have to be very careful now, especially as we talk about vaccine development, to take the public with us, to reassure them, to make sure they understand what vaccine development is about, how new vaccines and drugs are tested, what are the phases, what are the safety mechanisms, and then how it's finally licensed, based on what kind of criteria and what role the regulatory bodies have. So I think these three things, the genomics, the speed at which the science has moved, and the infodemic would be three things that stand out for me. Now, we've just come out of a 2-day meeting on research and innovation. We had a global virtual forum, of course, which was a follow-up to the forum that we had organized in February. And the idea was to bring together scientists and researchers and academics from all over the world at that time in February to develop a research roadmap for this virus. And we organized ourselves into 9 working groups. And we decided now 4 months have passed, we should reconvene to take stock of what we know, to celebrate the progress, to see what has been the impact of all of this research, and to plan for the future. What are the existing and emerging research priorities? What are the gaps, the big gaps in knowledge? And it was a very fascinating 2 days, 4 hours on each day, 9 working groups, starting with the origin of the virus, the animal source of the virus, and what could be the things that could be done for risk reduction in the future, so we don't have more jumps like this from animal to human, and we still don't know if it came directly from bats to humans or whether it went through an intermediate host. And that investigation is underway. And then we have all of this work on the transmissibility of the virus. We started off knowing that it's droplet transmission and fomite transmission. There are studies which are showing that asymptomatic and people without any symptoms, pre-symptomatic people, can spread the infection. But there are small particles in addition to large droplets which come out even during normal speech, even during singing, not just coughing and sneezing, which could infect people if you're in close proximity. And that's why the minimum 1 meter distance. And that's why the mask wearing, if you are not able to physically distance and you live in an area with community transmission, then it's good that everybody wears a mask when they step out. So all of these learnings have happened over a period of time, and we've been also adapting our guidance as and when we learn more. Now, is it truly an airborne infection? I think the jury is still out on that, in the sense that, as I said, we know that there are droplets. Small droplets can get aerosolized. They're less than 5 microns, less than 1 micron. These can hang around in the air, for some time. We also know that closed environments and spaces are particularly high risk for spread. So if you have an asymptomatic person who's in an office setting or in a other closed setting where there is not much of air circulation, you could potentially, there have been some case studies where potentially one person has ended up infecting 30, 50, even 80 people. Now, again, I've been asking colleagues in India to analyze the data that we have, and we've done huge numbers of tests now with over 600,000 positive tests and millions of negative tests to analyze what are the risk factors for the positivity, what groups are these positivity happening in, and to do cohort studies to follow up cohorts of these people, and then especially the household studies are the most critical to do. And these were done in China. So I must say, in the middle of this huge new epidemic and overloaded health system, the Chinese really did a lot of studies and published them very rapidly. And that really helped us to understand the disease, whether it was a clinical profile and a management, or whether it was things like these household transmission studies and cluster investigations that they did, which showed us what is a secondary transmission from the index case to the household. And how much is it if you're symptomatic and how much is it if you're asymptomatic? There's clearly a difference. If you're symptomatic, you transmit more than if you're asymptomatic, but asymptomatics can transmit. It's also important for public health to know and to take action, because asymptomatic means if that's that's contributing, then the only way is physical distancing, masking, and all those kinds of precautions. Whereas if the spread is mainly from symptomatic, you need to really detect early, put them in isolation, and screen all the contacts and quarantine them. So both probably are needed. But what is missing is these kind of in-depth investigations from India. The other thing interesting is about these super spreaders and people. It is now believed that 20% of people who are infected are responsible for 80% of the spread. How can we find these 20%? And there's been some hypotheses that you can have the cycle threshold value, the CT value on the RT-PCR as one of the markers, of course, of high viral load. But again, this has to be done in proper studies with follow-up. If we can find biomarkers for people who are likely to transmit more, and also those who are likely to get sick, we can focus on those people and give them the kind of care so that they don't develop complications. There's a lot we've learned about treatment, both in terms of oxygen therapy, ventilation, and in terms of the drugs. And it was good to see so many clinical trials starting quite early on, especially with repurposed drugs like hydroxychloroquine, lopinavir, ritonavir, etc. And today we're in a position, and again, it's incredible that in 3.5, 4 months, we're in a position now to know which drugs are working and which are not working, because the only way to know that is through well-conducted clinical trials. So we know, for example, hydroxychloroquine does not work, absolutely no effect on severely ill patients or hospitalized patients with COVID. We know lopinavir, ritonavir doesn't work. We'll be also coming out with the solidarity trial results very soon. Remdesivir seems to have some effect in reducing the duration of hospitalization and increasing recovery. Still, none of the trials have shown an impact on mortality. So then we have several trials of prophylaxis, pre-exposure and post-exposure prophylaxis going on. And now we're looking at the next generation of drugs. There's a lot of compound screening that's been happening. Unfortunately, doesn't seem to be much of a pipeline of antivirals. There's, I think, one new compound which is going into phase 1 trials now as an antiviral, which is an oral drug, and remdesivir is also being formulated as an inhaled drug. But in terms of the other approaches to treatment, we have the immunomodulatory, the steroids, of course, which are have been around with us for a long time, which have been now shown to have an impact again in severely ill patients. And dexamethasone was helpful in reducing mortality, but other immunomodulators, which can be given to suppress the cytokine storm, as well as antithrombotic agents, need to be tested. And then we have the monoclonal antibodies, which look promising, because ultimately when we found in Ebola, it was the monoclonal antibodies that worked. In fact, there were two of them. One was a cocktail of 3 monoclonals and one was a 1 monoclonal, were both shown to be effective in Ebola. And remdesivir was actually a drug that was made for Ebola, but it was not found to be effective. So monoclonal antibodies, there is a lot of potential both for prevention and for treatment, and this will also need further exploration. So vaccines, where are we with vaccines? We have a very robust pipeline. We have over 200, at least 150 if you look at those who have reached some stage of preclinical development. 17 already in human clinical trials. That's an amazing accomplishment, again, within a matter of a few months. And again, the reason was that the genetic sequence data was used very quickly to put onto platforms like the RNA platform, the DNA platform, as well as platforms like the viral vectors, where you just have to take the antigen of choice and you put it onto the existing platform. That's why it moved rapidly. But again, till the phase 3 trials are done, till safety and efficacy are established, we do not know which and how many of these vaccines will prove to be effective and safe. And so we should be optimistic, but cautiously optimistic, and we cannot take shortcuts. Every vaccine has to go through the steps of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. We are very conscious that some vaccines in the past have had what is called ADEs, antibody dependent enhancement, which means that the disease, that you can actually get a worse form of the disease if you're vaccinated. This was seen with the dengue vaccine. So one has to be careful while you do the trials. People have to be followed up for enough time. Enough numbers have to be enrolled in the trials. And so the WHO is proposing a solidarity trial for vaccines, where we're hoping that vaccine developers will come and join. This will be a global trial. It will be done in many countries so that you can enroll very quickly. And it would also help to take many candidates through clinical trials. Our goal is to test as many as possible and test them till they fail. And it's also more cost-effective way of doing it. So there was a good discussion on vaccine trials, in fact, yesterday at this virtual forum. What should be the minimum criteria and how the regulatory agencies might look at a vaccine. If you get a vaccine with 20% efficacy, are we going to be satisfied? Or do we want a vaccine with at least a minimum of 50% efficacy? And what should be the lower bound of that, and so on for the trial. So a lot of technical discussions happened, and we are happy that many trials are now going on, and by the end of the year, we should have results on several of them. So again, cautiously optimistic that a couple of the vaccines would prove to be effective and safe, and then would be available for people early in 2021. But initially at very limited doses. And this is where we are working now to raise funding for investing in manufacturing in advance, so that companies don't wait till they get their phase 3 results in order to ramp up manufacturing. So you can shorten the timelines by overlapping some of these activities, not by compromising on the quality of the trials, but by investing upfront in manufacturing, by working with regulators to harmonize regulatory requirements, and working with developers to have more efficient clinical trial designs. These are and then having a large portfolio of vaccines. So these are the ways in which we can increase the likelihood of some vaccine becoming available quickly. And in fact, that seems at the moment to be the only way out of this pandemic. So as we say, and the DG of WHO also says quite often that the way out of this pandemic is science. And I hope that the science academies in India could actually play a bigger role in guiding the response to the epidemic in India and possibly in the whole of South Asia, because a lot has been also written about what is there a paradox? Is there an enigma? Why are there less deaths? Why have cases not taken off? And we have been cautious. I've been saying it could be a matter of time. There's nothing about the Indian population that could protect from this virus. If we let our guard down, it will explode. And luckily, there's been from the beginning a serious approach to it and interventions that have been put in. So maybe towards the end of my talk, I would like to go to, this is where I could share my screen. So basically what I just wanted to go through was what is available in terms of preparedness. And there was a report that came out about 6 months ago. This is an older one. This is about talking about updating a national pandemic influenza preparedness plan. I told you that influenza was considered the virus with the most potential for a pandemic. And therefore, countries were asked to do all of this, do a situation analysis, have a multi-sectoral planning committee, and then develop or update a plan, have a consensus, consolidate it, and then disseminate the plan and have it approved by government authorities and so on. Now, we set up, along with the World Bank, a global preparedness monitoring board. This was set up actually in 2018 or so, after the Ebola outbreak of 2014-15. It was felt that, again, you need to review the world's preparedness, and a high-level committee need to be set up. So this is a very high-level committee, which has about 10 or 12 members. Professor Vijay Raghavan is a member of this committee from India. It's co-chaired by Gro Harlem Brundtland and Asad LC, who was the head of the IFRC. And they actually came out with this report in October last year. So this was before anything like this was, had happened. And they said that there are 7 urgent actions that the world needs to take to prepare for health emergencies, and that all of these actions should be completed by September 2020. So they gave 1 year's time for this. And the first one, of course, was political commitment, that there should be investment, there should be a costed national action plan for health security with identified resources, and then this plan should be implemented. So this was the first urgent step. Then they said countries and regional organizations must lead by example. So the G7, the G20, the G77, and so on, they monitor their commitments to prepare for preparedness for health emergencies. Then they mentioned that all countries must build strong systems. So they said at a minimum, 59 countries that have completed the National Action Plan for Health Security, they should identify a high-level coordinator to implement the national preparedness measures, and that WHO, World Bank, and partners working with countries should develop and cost packages of priority interventions to increase preparedness capacity, and that should be then financed in the budget cycles, and that there should be fewer but better harmonized coordination mechanisms, global, regional, and country networks, institutions, and initiatives for preparedness, readiness, and for R&D. The fourth point was that countries, donors, and multilateral institutions must be prepared for the worst and should have timelines for financing and development of a universal flu vaccine, broad spectrum antivirals, and targeted therapeutics, and that WHO and its member states should develop options for standard procedures and timelines for sharing of sequence data, specimens, and medical countermeasures for pathogens other than influenza. See how relevant this is now, because we're talking now about sharing of data, sharing of specimens, and sharing of vaccines and therapeutics. And there's going to be a lot of global debate on these issues. And then they talked about developing a multi-year plan and approach for strengthening R&D research capacity in advance of and during an epidemic. So this is something that WHO has actually done, because after the Ebola outbreak, there was something called the R&D blueprint that was created, and it was a platform to actually invest in R&D for neglected diseases like Ebola, but also they included 9 other diseases, including Nipah and MERS and Crimean Congo hemorrhagic fever, mostly the kind of MERS viral fevers that can cause outbreaks and big epidemics. And through that mechanism, there's been WHO's worked with other partners to invest, and we worked closely with India when the Nipah outbreak happened to put in place protocols for rapid assessment of therapeutics as well as diagnostics. And we've worked, of course, in Ebola, doing the clinical trials for therapeutics and for vaccines in the Democratic Republic of Congo. And then it also led to the creation of this body called CEPI, the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation, which is investing in vaccines for these diseases. Now they're investing also in a big way in vaccines for COVID. So preparing R&D to do R&D in the midst of an emergency needs advanced preparation and investment, and that's what is highlighted here. Then financing institutions must link preparedness with financial risk planning, and that they should expand the scope, World Bank and IMF, etc., so that they can fund health emergency preparedness. So now the World Bank is giving a lot of loans and grants to countries to strengthen health systems, but particularly focusing on health emergency preparedness. This had been done in advance, it would have been even better. And then they say development assistance funders must create incentives and increase funding for preparedness, and that they should contribute more to the contingency fund for emergencies, which the WHO operates to a tune of at least 100 million. And then it talks about the United Nations strengthening coordination mechanisms. So the Secretary General, along with other arms of the United Nations, to do both simulation exercises, system-wide training, etc., and mobilize international, national, multilateral action. So if you can see, these 7 recommendations they made are actually extremely relevant. And then operational readiness of countries, there was a preliminary categorization that was done. So as I mentioned, there's the IHR state parties annual reporting. It's a self-assessment tool, and then there's a joint external assessment. And the current position was made on a continuum of scenarios: preparedness, high risk for imported cases, local and community transmission. And then this categorization was refined based on either the self-assessment, but also with missions to the countries and up-to-date analyses. And if you see how it maps out, as the country's capacity increases, that is to the left of the slide, level 5 is the highest capacity. The preparedness, it is kind of linked. The number of cases and the amount of support they've needed has been linked with the extent of pre-existing capacity. So finally, to have a strategic preparedness and response plan, which we've currently developed now for this outbreak, but this is going to be necessary in the longer run. A few objectives are going to be key. One is to establish international coordination, which the WHO has been doing actually to deliver strategic, technical, and operational support. But you also need mechanisms for logistics and supplies. So we've seen early in the outbreak that the PPE, the personal protective equipment, and the diagnostic kits and the reagents were in very short supply globally. And there was a mad rush to buy these things. And it was very inequitably distributed. So we need a mechanism also for distribution of these countermeasures. Then scaling up country preparedness and response, including strengthening the readiness to rapidly identify, diagnose, and treat cases, identify and follow up contacts. Many countries do not have the capacity, the public health capacity and the workforce to do contact tracing. And you cannot do contact tracing with just volunteers pulled from here and there at the last minute. You need a workforce if you want to do it properly. They have to be trained, they have to be monitored, and they should be there, for a consistent period of time. So this has been a big problem. Infection prevention and control in healthcare settings. We've talked about it a long time, especially with respect to AMR, but it's also very important to prevent the spread of these infections within healthcare settings. Implementation of health measures for travelers, and very important and often neglected, awareness raising in the population through risk communication and community engagement. That again has been missing in many countries where the communities are just confused or they are not very cooperative because they don't know exactly what is happening and why they're being told to do some things. And the third major objective is to accelerate research and innovation, both to set priorities and also to scale up research and development, so that ultimate aim is the equitable availability and access of therapeutics, vaccines, and diagnostics, and to build a common platform for standardized processes, protocols, and tools to facilitate multidisciplinary and collaborative research integrated within the response. Very important. And this is part of the strategic response plan that we prepared and put out in April. But this is what we tried to do from the beginning. The science division that I lead was in the forefront of trying to bring together researchers, fostering collaborative research, highlighting the big gaps in knowledge, getting the funders to come together to try and focus on the important questions, and then having a harmonization of protocols, standardize the lab assays, have certain labs which can provide the standard reagents, etc. All of that is extremely important, and if it has been thought of in advance, it's much easier to accomplish than rather than trying to do it once or in the middle of a pandemic. So that, I think, brings me to the end of my slides, and I will now stop and turn over to you. I think we have a short period of time. Maybe you want to do some question and answers, Partha, but I leave it to you.
So the question is, if vaccines are injected without any critical and proper clinical trials, isn't there a chance of high mortality rate?
Can you say that again? If vaccines are?
If vaccines are injected without very critical and proper clinical trials, isn't there a chance of high mortality rate?
So I would say that there is no question of injecting vaccines without properly conducted clinical trials. It's absolutely impossible in any country with basic regulatory mechanisms to do that. And as I said, it's not just the mortality. You may or may not have a high mortality, but you want to know how it works and whether it works. And what is the efficacy of protection of that vaccine, and what is the safety profile of that vaccine. So absolutely, proper clinical trials, as I said, in enough numbers of patients with enough endpoints, with a placebo group. So you have to have a vaccine group and a placebo group to compare the two. And you can have placebo till the world has a vaccine which is considered efficacious. Then it becomes unethical to have placebo. But till then, you can have a placebo in the trial, and you can do trials fast. It's not that you cannot do trials fast, but you still have to do it with all the scientific rigor and collect all the data that is going to be important for us to make decisions on which vaccine. And as I said, because there are so many vaccines in development, it's really important, because hopefully we will be in a situation where we can choose, that we will have several successful vaccine candidates. Some may have some features which are preferable for certain age groups and so on. So maybe we'll be able to pick. I see that the ICMR announcement has caused some concern. There's something in the chat And I don't think ICMR is saying, I think it's been misinterpreted. And it is not possible to do phase 1, 2, and 3 trials within a matter of a few weeks. So hopefully they would complete the phase 1 trials by August and then move into phase 2 and 3 trials after that.
Soumya, can I ask a question? You emphasize the need for social science research and behavioral research during this pandemic, or as preparedness for the pandemic. Again, it comes from some personal, encounters with diagnostics or spread of diagnostic testing. One of the things that is coming in the way, and you have talked about building a workforce, etc., is the fear and stigma. There's a lot of stigmatization that's happening in the society. Of course, there is fear of contraction of the infection, but aside from that, stigmatization has been huge. So, do you have any thoughts as to how one needs to prepare, or how a country needs to prepare itself against such stigmatization and fear?
No, absolutely. I think it's good you raised that, because I always talk about social and behavioral research, and somehow I forgot to do that. It is critical, and there is no public health intervention that can be successful without behavior change communication. And you mentioned stigma. I talked about mental health problems. I talked about fear, anxiety, people not wanting to go for diagnostic testing. I've been working with several state governments to advise them on how to put in place, systems. And this is always one element I emphasize, that you must have a task force or a group looking at social and behavioral science, looking at messaging, at communication, as well as at having some kind of hotlines where people can call in, not just to answer questions, but also to provide some sort of counseling when they are going through some anxious period. So, because there are so many unknowns here, I think it's a very important issue that you raised, Partha. I totally agree with you, and I think it's often neglected, unfortunately.
So there are a few more questions. Can I read them out to you? This is a question that states, there has been such a high variability in treatment protocols. Would it not have been better for the WHO to actually put out treatment protocols that physicians could track?
So we have been putting out treatment protocols, and we have also been updating it. In fact, now we are looking at our treatment guidelines. We will come out, because now the clinical trials the larger clinical trials actually are completing, and the data is coming through. So dexamethasone, hydroxychloroquine, lopinavir, remdesivir, all of these will go into our clinical guidelines. We also have a clinical trial model protocol on the website for anyone to use. So both in terms of the testing in trials and in terms of using the drugs, we have been putting out guidance right from the beginning.
So another question is, at this juncture, what are the 3 important points that WHO would like India to do that's related to understanding this virus?
I think a better analysis of the data that's available would be really good to know. For example, where is the testing happening, and where are the cases being concentrated? Now, of course, case detection is related to testing. So just numbers alone doesn't help. We have to look at criteria like tests per million or tests per lakh, and positivity rate. And we have seen the hotspots in the urban areas. I have felt that we need a model, a strategy for urban areas, which is different from the high income countries, because we have highly congested urban slums where people cannot physically distance. And so you need a solution which is very different from the kind of physical distancing and lockdowns that were done in high income countries, where everybody has a home where they can stay comfortably. So those are the kind of models and strategies we need to develop, which are suited to our own setting. So we need a separate one for rural areas, and one for urban and mega cities probably needs a different one. And we need more clinical trials. I think there's a lot of talk of traditional medicine, of many different drugs, but there should be clinical trials to prove or disprove whether they're effective in prevention or in treatment. And I think, of course, there can be a lot more basic science work done, which I'm sure is already going on. But really, at the moment, what you need are the focus on what works in terms of public health and social measures that have been implemented. What works and what doesn't work. And I think reporting on data on some of those. So we need more of an interdisciplinary approach, I think, and a group of scientists, researchers who work side by side with the government to actually test, because you have to keep on adapting and evolving as you move on and improving your response.
Yeah, I don't think that there are any more new questions. There are a few questions that are related to the ones that you have already addressed. So I think since there are no new questions and we are right at the end of the public lecture that Professor Swaminathan has given, I again take this opportunity to thank you, Soumya. This was wonderful, and coming from you, it means a lot to us because these are the kinds of steps that need to be taken. I hope that you said that the academies must play a bigger role in all of this, and honestly, sometimes we are lost. We don't even know what kind of role to play because the health system of the country doesn't reach out to the academies and all of this. But that's a separate story altogether. We need to discuss that as an aside. Having said that, I think these preparedness kinds of things that you said are absolutely critical, and we hope that India also will live up to these prescriptions that you have made or suggestions that you have made. Thank you very much. And again, on behalf of the Academy, the entire fellowship and associateship, and this was an open lecture, so on behalf of the entire audience, again, I'm very grateful to you, and we would actually like you to come and visit the Academy and give a lecture one of these days when you come back to, or when you visit India. So thank you very much, and it was just absolutely stunning and wonderful. Thank you.